the the thing which struck me about the whole conversation is that on the standards side, there is a very strong desire to contribute, and there are some, if I detect correctly as a non-expert, some innovative ideas about how standards can be empowered, including in jurisdictions as legislative and slow as the European Union, to make progress faster and to influence the innovation pathway faster. But and I think the Australian example shows that it's perfectly possible. It's a trust problem, but not with AI, but between actors in a jurisdiction. Often mistrust and institutional power plays prevent Europe from being agile. It's not that those who are, there's not a contract of non-agility in the European Union bureaucracy. So I think the question is, where could that conversation be accelerated so that we don't just see a few flowers blooming in one or other part of one or other jungle and continue to think it would be a nice thing? It seems to me at some stage, the standards bodies that think there is a better way need to engage with legislators and executives so that we get there. So I see two arms raised on that. First Toby and then Touraj.
Thanks. I'll just say, why did it happen in Australia? It happened because we were having an election and it had broad public support, especially from parents. And one party said they'll do it, the other party had to say they'll do it, therefore it was done. These things happen when you get the public behind them.
Yeah, okay. Touraj?
Yeah, so I already mentioned the question of acceleration, but let me tell you a little bit more about that because I think it's really central in our conversation. Um, uh, it was said, in fact, I think I was one of them who said that also, that leaving definition of standards to only engineers and technicians would be wrong. But the other extreme of leaving legislations without any input, without any understanding of where things are going, technology-wise, would be as wrong. And I want to make my case in two ways. I give you the example of a little bit futuristic, but then I tell you about the legislation that I think it has a big problem. We are past what AI used to be in the last 30 years, which was mainly expert systems, model-based, etc. Now we are currently in the middle of what is called generative AI. People are looking at what agentic AI is. Then there are talks about embodied AI. These are robots that are like humanoids, etc. Go around, understand the world, create technologies. We are going to have soon quantum AI because the power of quantum computing is going to resolve a lot of problems. The problem of energy that I heard was mentioned among them. Then ultimately, you could like or hate it, but also the talk about transhumanity and how AI is going to influence brain-computer interface processes that are going to augment human capacity using AI. And I'm not even entering into other things like genetic engineering, all sorts of things like that. Now, I'm saying all this because I think there is an understanding, maybe wrongly, or at least implied, that AI is something static. It's not. In fact, the AI that most legislators are thinking is already obsolete. So if every time there is some company coming up with the latest gimmick and platform that they come up with, a legislator have to go and discuss how we can have laws, etc., to prevent that. We're not going to get anywhere, and EU Act is a good example of that, because by the time something comes up, it's too late, it's too small, it's insufficient, it comes with a lot of problems. So I think that the acceleration, as I told you, it's really extremely important that research, innovation, and legislation, including standardization, are really done at the same time. I know it's a little bit hard to say it this way, but we don't have really any other choice. Because if we take the logical approach, we're not going to get anywhere. If you allow me, I can give you maybe now or later an example, a concrete example, what is in a EU AI Act, which is Article 50, which is basically obsolete, I can tell you. It's not going to be very useful. And there are maybe others, but one I'm personally very familiar with.
Thank you very much. We could make, I'm sure, even around this table, a list of pieces of legislation that were dead when they arrived, and that may well, and maybe even of standards. But I think that the point is well taken. The key question, I think, if I can just ask a follow-up before we move on to Ansgar and Nushin, is are standards bodies as currently configured capable themselves of self-tasking earlier, and not just when they're prodded by a company or a country?
Yes. So basically, what I'm saying is that this approach of really having multi-stakeholder and not cut it into stages and not waiting for things to be understood before doing it, but we have to collectively try to do all of it at the same time, more or less, shouldn't be only applied to standardization, also to legislation. So we have to go really one step even farther. Currently, there is a talk about merging these three stages of standardization, innovation, and research. I think that legislation should be added to it.
Thank you. Then I think Ansgar was next, and then Nushin, and then Albin.
It may be worthwhile to reflect on a parallel process also connected to the AI Act that happened, in this drive to try to bring in clear, actionable guidance on how to be compliant with obligations under the AI Act, which was the development of the code of practice for general purpose AI, the GPI code of practice, where the Commission decided that it might be faster for this to be created through a European Commission driven multi-stakeholder approach that didn't go through CENELEC or any other established standardization body. Now, arguably, yes, it produced a piece of work rapidly, but there are questions as to whether or not this process managed to capture the right type of expertise to be brought in to the table. And certainly, as the process was going on, we did see a large amount of concerns about who was having the most impact on the shaping of this standard, this code of practice. Was this code of practice ultimately drafted by a handful of big tech companies who happen to be the ones that, at this point in time, are the ones leading in the development of this particular type of general purpose AI, the large language models, which, to touch on the point that Ibrahim is making, large language models may be currently the way in which we're approaching general purpose AI, but this may change in the not so distant future. And so questions arise whether this kind of code of practice is really the best kind of code of practice needed for this kind of space. Now, I'm not saying that necessarily CENELEC would have been able to deliver something at speed that would have fit the political timeline for this. And we sure hope that this code of practice will also be reviewed within the broader standardization space to create some strong international standards on this topic. But I think the experience that we saw here was interesting because on the one hand, it was a case of exploration. Is there an alternative methodology that can be used to create the operationalization of regulation? And various attempts were made to pull in certain type of stakeholders, and questions got raised as to whether it worked. Certainly from our side, one of the big questions we saw is, did the many organizations and bodies that represent stakeholders that are not the key creators of the technology, but rather the adopters, deployers, or those impacted by the technology, did they have enough of an input on this kind of a important code of practice that's going to impact the types of safeguards that we are all going to be relying on when it comes to this kind of technology? So just wanted to bring that reflection into the discussion.
I think it's clear, Ansgar, that improvisation didn't land well, and you're certainly right that there were criticisms from those who felt it had been taken over. But of course, those criticisms are sometimes voiced about all other forms of decision making, whether in Europe or elsewhere, certainly for standards itself. And so I think that structure point is well taken. But the pity is that probably the lesson most of the bureaucracy will have learned is we won't try that again. Whereas what I'm hearing in this session is we need to try more innovative things like that, but with better preparation. And I think the point about participation speaks to the one unspoken strength of the standards process, which is the density of the networks and the importance of the sort of peer respect that keeps standards making relatively an honest process. So I think there's definitely a lesson to be learned there. Nushin, you were next.
Thank you. I wanted to actually mention something that at the beginning, when I started my introduction, basically, I mentioned about the shift that we are going from something that we knew its environment, its use, its misuse, what we are standardizing basically to this area that it's a bit more overwhelming than what it used to be. And there is this shift. And I really believe that the whole activities about the standardization of AI was also a kind of one of its kind, because we had the AI regulation. We already started the standardization work in parallel to our usual process is that we have the law, we make standards to comply to the law. But here we did the standardization in parallel to the policy and legislative negotiations, basically. So when actually the EU AI Act was just proposal, so a lot of negotiations happened, and the standardization was, we went through a new type of activities that the standardization are trying to catch up and to become more and more instrumental for the implementation of the law. I wanted maybe to mention something that this became also some certain lesson learned as well for the European standardization system, that how fast, how can we be more agile, how we can trigger more, how can we get more involvement, what are our tools, how can we reach out, what are the fundings, what are the potential tools that we could use to bring in and create this pool of expertise, for example. These were not maybe a big question for us in the traditional sectors, let's say. When we are talking about the machinery sector, for example, it's a huge network. We already know our stakeholders in Europe at international level. We have plenty of tools in place that we have been using for decades. We have development, we are perfectly placed with our international counterparts at ISO and IEC. We have a relation, we have a mechanism in place how to work together with our national European standardization bodies. But with the AI, it all became clear that we are shifting, going towards a system. I heard that open source was mentioned, for example, in the field of cybersecurity. Now, this is something that we are considering in SEN and SENELEC, how we can involve open source community to our standardization. So what I wanted to say is that I understand that the whole discussion about innovation, legislation, etc., but going towards standardization in the field of AI, cybersecurity, quantum, etc., is taking the standardization system towards the way, thinking about how we can be more agile, how can we involve more and engage more people, not only from Europe, how can we be more inclusive towards external. We are revising, for example, our guides that how we reach out to other stakeholders outside of Europe. How can we work with the open source community, for example, with our maybe business model that we have currently in place. So I just wanted to say that there's a huge, strong signal that we received that we need to also look internally what we can do to be more agile, to be more adapted to the needs coming from regulation or from the market, basically. So I just wanted to mention this. And one maybe example, and a second point I wanted to mention is also, it's not only about the regulation that pushes, it's driving basically the standardization work, it's also the market. And in the field of quantum, for example, what we are calling it, and I really like this, that we say we need a common language. So the people around the table working on quantum technologies, we have a fantastic research institute. We have even small ecosystems of quantum technologies in Netherlands, in France, in Germany, so many places, but they need to communicate. And for that, we need standards. So there are certain things that we need to actually be more agile before even regulation is in place. So we are developing certain standards before we are discussing about the proposal for a Quantum Act coming maybe next year. So I think there are a certain level of agility that also the standardization, the ISOs are learning, that how we can be preparing, bringing together this pool of expertise before even going towards legislation, and how can we become a point of feedback basically to basic policymakers. And that's it I wanted to mention.
And I think on that, I mean, if you go back to the point you're making, I think is very important. Can we show that innovators themselves will be more communicative earlier? And in order to do that, now is a good time to think about it. In European governance, in the European research area, we are actually, I think, going backwards in the sense that openness was a principle of so-called responsible research and innovation as a must-do for 2 successive research programs. And now, in the discussions on the current 7-year programming, it's actually missing. So I think there's a sort of actionable thing, and I say it now because CENELEC would be the people to do it, to sort of re-inject upstream openness and engagement as something that innovation communities need to do. So it's just a comment in passing. Albina, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. Just to add my piece, indeed, multi-stakeholder engagement with the innovative community, with designers and everyone who develops and works later with AI is important. But from social perspective, we are taking different approach. We are not narrowing down the reflection of all this massive, interpretive, very highly volatile social potential impact to the standards. Around the convention, we decided to go in a different way. When we worked on Huderia model and methodology, we said we're putting in place a number of questions related either to human rights or societal democratic impact of AI tools. We propose them to be asked by those who design, deploy, develop, and then they will see what they need to introduce into the systems in order to avoid this potential risk map. So it's a way actually from putting fixed standards, and that's actually the way how it was used by the development of the whole corpus of case law of the around human rights development since the end of World War II. Like that, we remain agile, and also we remain more flexible to interpretation. Because the scalability, for example, we proposed to ask the question, what would be potentially the scalability of the damage if your system is deployed in this context? What would be potentially irreparability or not of the damage? So when the actors who are involved in standards or in the development of systems or development of standards, they ask these questions, then they find the need for this multi-stakeholder engagement to go through the risk and find the ways to cover the societal issues. And it would leave us a possibility to be technology neutral, because depending on the way the technology develops, we see the impact on different human rights. Again, I'm looking at that from Council International Organization perspective or human rights perspective. For example, of course, now everyone talks about AI and its impact on freedom of expression, freedom of association, or issues which are quite already everywhere in our minds. But for example, we were talking about neurotechnological developments. We see new coming problems with, for example, if we, again, European example, Article 9 of the European Convention of Human Rights is freedom of thought. And freedom of thought was never been at stake inside freedom of thought as now with the development of neurotechnologies. So this is why we try to have a very scalable recommendations of questions, societal questions, and human rights and rule of law questions, which has to be asked, but in not framing there in something which is fixed around the standards, because otherwise it would be obsolete. And I hope that this will show us a good way forward.
Thank you. Enrico.
Yes, just to say that the liaison between what we are doing in standards and what is applicable or not, and so the regulatory sandbox, I think is going to be fundamental to help standard to write the good requirement that then can be applied. So some principles that are raising that were just quoted now have to be tested on the ground so that the requirement will not be only theoretical, but will have a technical point that on the process they should be respected to align with the principles. That's just it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, if I'm not mistaken, the list of speakers and questions is complete. I would like to very much thank those, including those who've had to leave early, for giving us such a rich overview. And I'd just like to say a couple of things as a sort of conclusion. The first is that we've talked a lot about standards and governance. We've heard from excuse me, from Seoul and the Asia Pacific and the Council of Europe and European communities endeavors and the global endeavors of ISO. The elephant in the room is whether people believe in cooperative alignment of principles and rules. And of course, the media every day give us some reasons to doubt whether that mutual commitment is as strong as it needs to be. So I think that there's a reality check out there which is a bit of a worry. If, like most of us, you spend most of your time trying to make good rules and standards which will then apply broadly to bring efficiency and well-being to humankind. At the same time, the encouraging thing is that the system, the interlocking levels of system, and we established that even in Australia there are some interlocking levels, enable us to ride through geopolitical threats up to a point. So I think that there is an elephant in the room, but it doesn't necessarily promise to, or even think it's able to trample over everything that those in the room are doing. And to illustrate that, the second point I wanted to emphasize was the point about, in a way, people power. Nushin began by saying that, you know, getting citizens somehow involved, not just through opinion polling, not just through expertise, can be important. And as I've said a couple of times, I think that this is it remains a radical idea for all of us who think we know better. And therefore, it was quite important a decade ago when the responsible research and innovation paradigm was injected into publicly funded innovation in Europe. It's not as high a priority now as it needs to be. And that whole area of how do you make sure that what you're doing is relevant to real people is, I think, an important reality check. The third thing I wanted to say is that to a degree that I, as a sort of naive subject, am surprised at, this conversation really speaks to the need for standards to be promoted, standards to the fore, coming earlier and also ranking higher in the weightings. I have to sort of hold my hand up and confess that when I was a European legislator, regulator, whatever, I don't think we involved people who knew about standards upstream often enough. And I think, therefore, that is a quite strategic message, which probably is not heard at all by anybody outside the little bubble that this panel and working group represents. And so there's a communications challenge, I think, for global standards communities to engage with the people who can actually change the way processes are habitually made. And as Ansgar's example of the GPAI code of practice shows, people with goodwill to change the system don't necessarily know how to do it safely, at least on a first attempt. So there's no single button you can push. But if we want to have standards earlier, more involved in policy making and governance, and not just a tool at the end of the pipe, that requires probably coordinated effort by leading voices in the standards community. And the final point, excuse me, which is relevant to all three of those, is that it's a matter of money. And too often, participation in standards, as in many other things, is a problem of money. And getting the less known voices is a problem of money. Getting people who are geographically distant, maybe it's less a problem these days because we have wonderful technology. But the key, I think, to building on the wisdom that was laid out today will be to find the people who can allocate a bit more resources a bit earlier to using standards. Maybe it's in AI, maybe quantum is the opportunity, or other emerging technologies, to actually pilot instances where we go faster with standards first. So those would be my conclusions. And as I say, they're those of a naive observer. The interesting coincidence in the Brussels bubble is that the guy who used to was deputy head of the AI office is now the head of the director of the team dealing with emerging technologies. So maybe there's an opportunity at least to pilot this sort of engagement in one town around the planet. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks to those of you who've been with us and stayed. Thanks again to all the speakers. And I can't really wish you a safe journey home because we are in a virtual setting, but I hope that you have an enjoyable day wherever you are. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the sessions in our conference.